Hey guys, welcome back to my channel and thank you so much for watching. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how I made Stitch from Lilo & Stitch, so let's get right into it. I'm starting out with two 6-inch cakes that I've leveled and cut in half, and I'm going to be filling those with my vanilla Swiss meringue buttercream that I've added a little bit of blackberry puree to. All recipes and materials I use in this cake will be listed below. Now that my cake is stacked up, I've made a 4-inch cake board that I'm centering on top of the cake, just trying my best to get it in the middle. My cake was chilled for this next step. I need to start carving, so I'm basically just trying to make A-line cuts from the edge of my 4-inch board all the way down to the edge of my bottom 6-inch layer. You want to make sure that you go slow. It's way easier to take off more than it is to put it back. So once I've worked my way all the way around, it looked a little something like this. Now I can crumb coat my cake. I'm adding a thin layer of that blackberry buttercream all the way around, and this is going to make sure that none of my crumbs end up in my final layer. To make Stitch's head, I have two 6-inch half ball cakes, and for one of those halves I need to carve off the bottom so that when I flip it over it's going to lay level and it's not going to roll around on me. I'm adding a little smear of my blackberry buttercream and then placing that 4-inch cake board on there, and then I'm going to flip my cake over. I leveled off both of my 6-inch ball cakes. It was a very moist cake batter, so this was a little bit messy, but once I did that I layered some more of my buttercream in between and then placed the top on. I wanted to add a little more on the sides of the head because his head is quite wide, so I mixed together some of my scrap vanilla cake with a little bit of my buttercream until I had this cake pop mixture, and I just started building out the sides of his face. For the mouth, I cut out this half moon shape, and then I crumb coated my whole cake and put that in the fridge for about 25 minutes to chill. Because I didn't want any of the seeds or any of the little bits of raspberry to show through, I ended up using a ganache for my final layer. I just used a milk chocolate ganache and went around the bottom of my cake with my spatula, just putting on a nice thick layer and then using my bench scraper to smooth it out. And for all the buttercream that accumulated on the top edge of my cake, I just pulled that into the center, just being careful not to mess up my nice level top. For the head, you can see I added some ganache in there, and then I used a template that I made for myself. I will link the one that I used below just to get a better spacing of where his eyes are going to go. So I marked those out using my template and then cut them out with my knife. I went a little deeper than I probably should have for this, so you don't need to make it super deep. I should have gone a little more shallow, but it still worked out, so it was okay. I filled in the eyes with ganache and let that sit in the fridge for a few minutes to set up. And then I went over the whole head with my ganache and smoothed it out as best I could using my little spatula. But then I went over the whole thing again with a piece of cardstock. You could also use a piece of acetate. It's really great because it can curve and then really get around the shape of the head. So I put the head and the body in the fridge for about 25 minutes to chill and really firm up, and I started on my fondant. I rolled out this blue fondant on my cornstarch surface to about 1/8 of an inch thick, and then I picked that up and draped it over the body of my cake, just working quickly with my hands and my fondant smoother to push all the air out from the top of my cake, and just worked my way down, pulling out the skirt and smoothing as I made my way down. I went over the whole thing one more time with my fondant smoother and then cut away the excess at the bottom using a pizza cutter. For the head, I did brush the outside with some water. You might find that your ganache set's a little bit hard and it needs some help for the fondant to stick. I did the same thing, rolled out my fondant to 1/8 of an inch thick, and then draped it over it and worked really quickly on the front of the face first. It is notoriously hard to cover round cakes without getting any creases. This was no different, but for the front, you can try to get it as smooth as possible so any of the mistakes end up at the back. I tried to smooth the eye sockets first, push all the air out of there, and then I gently pushed into the mouth. If the fondant tears a bit, that's totally fine. It's going to be covered. And just worked my way around the cake, doing my best to smooth until I reached the bottom. If you find that any air gets trapped in the eye sockets or the mouth, you can just use a pin to poke a hole and guide the air out with your finger. Using a scrap piece of fondant, I went around the entire cake. This just helps to get it extra smooth because your flat fondant smoother would not be good for this one. I used a balling tool just to really get into the mouth and push the fondant all the way back, and then my Dresden tool just to mark in the corners so they're a little more pronounced. Once I was happy with how it looked, I took my X-Acto knife and just trimmed away the fondant at the bottom. You are going to come away with like a little bit of a frayed edge in some spots. It's totally fine. Just do your best, like with a knife, to push those underneath just to try and smooth it out. Before I can add the head to the body, I need to add some support. So I have some wooden dowels that I'm spacing evenly throughout the bottom layer. I marked that off with my edible food marker and then cut those down to size. And I'm just supplementing with a couple straws here just to add some extra supports. And then before I sit the head on top, I'm adding a little more of my ganache just to act as some glue. I had the head on a cake lifter, so I'm just gently placing that down and centering it before that ganache sets up. To start working on the details, I have this lighter blue fondant and I've cut 2 eggy shapes out of it. You can see I rolled it a little bit on the thick side because I cut my eyes so deep. If you didn't cut yours as deep, then you don't need to roll these as thick. With my fingers, I'm smoothing down the edges. I want them to be flat against my work surface. You can see they look something like this. And then I attach them on either side, just using a little bit of water to help hold them in place. I used my little template to cut out the black pupil just to help me get the size right. I added those to either side as well, and then just used this oval type shape for the nose, and with my balling tool I marked in 2 nostrils at the bottom. I went a little ham pushing the fondant into the back of the mouth, and the fondant tore a little bit, but that's totally fine because it's going to be covered. I have some pink fondant and I'm adding the tongue, and with my fondant tool just marking a line down the center. Using a fluffy brush and my black color dust, I did the back of the mouth, and then I brought that a little bit onto the back of the tongue just to give it some more depth. I brushed that into the sides of his mouth and then just a little bit in front of the tongue in that mouth area. If you find that you are a little bit too messy and it goes all over the place, you can just use a Q-tip to help clean up your lines. Now I'm going to start adding the teeth. I rolled out my white fondant into these little toothy shapes. I just used the picture reference, again I've linked that below, and just tried to recreate the larger ones in the center and the smaller ones. I find it's a lot easier to start from the outside and work your way in. I attach these with water and use my fondant tool to help me space them out and move them around. You just want to make sure that the teeth are pointing more in towards the mouth, not straight out, so he looks like he's got a really big overbite. Once the mouth was done, I added 2 white catch lights in either of his eyes. Taking more of the blue I used to cover his body, I rolled out 3 snakes of fondant. 1 went around the top of his nose, and the other 2 framed the top of his eyes. To make his ears, I didn't really have a template, so I just made one up myself. I cut out this long ovally shape out of my blue fondant and then flipped it over because I wanted the back of it to be covered. I marked out a notch in either side. One had a notch higher up on the ear and one had a notch lower down. And then I rolled out some pink fondant and laid that over on top, just with the little border going all the way around so you could still see the blue. Using my smaller rolling pin, I curled the edges in, just making sure that the notch on either side was showing. It can take a little bit to get these to stay, but once they do, you have them in the good position that you want. It's really important that you let these sit until they dry. I added some Tylose powder to mine to help speed it up, so these dried within like 6 hours for me. But if you don't have Tylose powder, you can make these ahead, like the night before you're gonna decorate, and just make sure they sit overnight. For his tummy, I took more of my light blue fondant and then just cut out this semicircle shape and just attached it with some water. To make the forearms, I rolled out a sausage of fondant and then flattened against my work surface and made this like bowling pin type shape. So you have the definition around the shoulders, and then the bottom part is a little bit wider, tapering in at the bottom. So I placed those on either side and just pointed them towards each other at the end. I added another long oval for his hand, and then rolled out 4 blue balls of fondant for each of his fingers, and with my balling tool just marked in a divot into the bottom of each of those little fingers. For his back legs, I rolled out this fat teardrop shape and then just used a circle of thicker fondant for each of his feet. I just used water to attach those. And then just like the hands, I added the 4 little balls of fondant and marked in a spot for his nails with my balling tool. I cut out 2 circles of this darker blue fondant I added a little bit of black to and put those on either side of the bottom of his hind legs. And then all the nails were little balls of black fondant that I made to point with my fingers. With 2 small teardrop shapes of that blue fondant, I added 2 pieces on top for his head fluff. And then for another little tuft of hair on his chest, I had a flattened teardrop shape that I just scored some lines into using my fondant tool. To add the ears, mine still had a little bit of pliability in them and I wanted that, but you can add them when they're completely stiff. I'm using some melted chocolate and I'm just adding that to the side of my cake and then positioning the ear where I want it, and I'm holding on to that until I know the chocolate has completely hardened. It only takes like less than a minute, so it's not too long, but you want to make sure it's completely stiff before you take your hands away. For extra support in the ear while it dries, you can add a cake pop stick, and honestly from the front it's completely covered, so you could just leave this in if you're worried about transporting this somewhere, or once it's completely dried you can just pull it out and nobody will ever know. And this was the final result, guys. I added some brown sugar to the board for San. I think he turned out really cute, honestly way better than I had expected it to, so I'm super happy with this cake. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel for new videos every week. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.